Now that we have extensively looked at aims, let us outline classifications of objectives for teaching purposes under three main types, namely affective domain, psychomotor domain, cognitive domain. The objectives on one level make use of and build on behaviors found on the other levels. For an example, when learners write out a mathematical problem in writing, that is psychomotor, they are at the same time recalling information and thinking, which is cognitive, while they are likely to have some kind of emotional response that is effective to the task. Let us unpack and explain effective domain. The objectives in this domain are concerned with the emotional development of the learner. The affective domain deals with feelings, emotions, attitudes, interests, appreciation, value judgments, self-image, and motivation. Some teachers find it difficult to write behavioral objectives for the affective domain because it is hard to translate feelings, attitudes, appreciation, emotions, etc. into observable behaviors. Let's explain this concept by looking at an example. The objective, the learner will like reading, is not well stated because this behavior, like, is not observable. Learners must demonstrate something observable to show that they like reading. The words like reading could be replaced with volunteer to read aloud in class. Volunteering, however, is only one of the many possible indicators that the learners like reading. The following are examples of well-stated objectives in the affective domain. The learner should eagerly participate in class discussions of history-related topics. When given the opportunity to select the class reading, the learners should select poetry at least once during the term. The learners should attend a concert during the term without receiving credit for attendance. Given the opportunity, the learner should volunteer to stay after class and care for the plants in the classroom at least 3 times during the year. Let us now have a closer look at the objectives in the psychomotor domain. It emphasizes certain muscular and motor skills and range from beginner to expert performances. Objectives in the psychomotor domain usually contains elements of the affective and or cognitive domain, but the dominant objectives in subjects such as word processing, art, music, hospitality studies, etc. often fall in the psychomotor domain. Examples of well-stated objectives in the psychodomain include: given the board cut to the receive objectives of different shapes, the learner should place at least one of the objectives in the appropriately shaped cuts. Given a ruler and a sheet of graph paper, the learner should draw a neat straight line graph and correctly indicate all the points of intersection with the axis. From the audio recording of a symphony orchestra, the learner should list the names of 90% of the instruments playing in a 10-minute segment of the recording. After reading chapter 4 of a novel, learners should write a summary of 100 words in their workbooks. The third and final type of objectives we will discuss is the cognitive domain. This domain is concerned with the acquisition and manipulation of information, which is the development of intellectual abilities and skills. Learning intent in the cognitive domain ranges from the simple recalling of facts to the complex synthesis of information and the creation of new ideas. Let's move to closely define objectives by explaining behavioral objectives. A behavioral objective is an objective that is observable and very detailed, so that there can be no doubt whether the learner has definitely achieved the outcome or not. Look for an example at the following objective. Identify the following engine parts in a motor vehicle: radiator, starter motor, alternator, ignition system, battery, and gearbox. This objective is an example of a behavioral objective. There is nothing vague or doubtful about it. The desired behavior is described very clearly. The learner can either identify the radiator, starter motor, or other parts or not. Because the desired behavior is described so precisely, the examiner's role is clear-cut. There cannot be arguments whether the objective has been achieved or differences of opinion between several examiners. There are 3 rules to remember when dealing with behavioral objectives, namely, Rule 1 indicates to state the desired action of the learner, not yours as the teacher. Behavioral objectives do not describe the activities of you, the teacher, but the intended action that the learner should be more able to perform at the end of the lesson. It would therefore be incorrect to state, teach the external structure of a grasshopper, because this is not a behavioral objective at all. It is merely a statement of what you as the teacher intends to do. To change the statement into a behavioral objective, the desired end behavior of the learner should be stated. For an example, the learner should be able to label the external organs of a grasshopper on a relevant drawing. In Rule 2, you should state only one action. When you as a teacher state behavioral objectives, you should concentrate on only one action at a time. If you want learners to demonstrate 2 actions at the end of a lesson, you should state 2 distinct objectives. Only one action should be stated in a behavioral objective. For instance, it is incorrect to state the learner should be able to list the 3 main kinds of transportation and briefly explain each one. This statement is confusing. Suppose a learner is able to list the 3 main kinds of transportation, but unable to explain them. How will you assess whether the objective has been achieved? What should happen is this statement should be changed into 2 distinct behavioral objectives. Number 1, the learner should be able to list the 3 main kinds of transportation. And number 2, the learner should be able to explain each kind of transportation in 10 to 30 words. It is incorrect to use 2 verbs in a single clause. The statement, draw and label a plant, has 2 verbs and can be improved by being changed into 2 distinct objectives. Draw a plant and label the parts of a plant on a drawing. In Rule 3, you must use action verb. The verb used in the behavioral objective should describe an observable action. Many abilities described in critical and learning outcomes are not observable actions. Sometimes teachers state objectives without referring to an observable action. This type of vague language is acceptable in non-behavioral objectives, but not in behavioral objectives. In behavioral objectives, the verb that describes the desired end action is extremely important. As a rule, a lesson objective should have an action verb. An action verb is one that describes an observable action. Favorite action verbs often used by teachers are understand, analyze, experience, know, and become aware. Verbs that should as far as possible be avoided when one states a behavioral objective are non-action verbs such as apply, explain, calculate, fill in, classify, identify, define, label, describe, list, design, use, draw, write, investigate, and work out. Non-action verbs are acceptable when one states non-behavioral objectives because these are supposed to be vague. But when it comes to a lesson objectives, non-action verbs make it almost impossible for the teacher to assess whether a learner has achieved the objective. How does one establish whether someone knows something? We cannot open a person's head and see what he or she knows. We need to use action verbs such as explain or describe to have evidence that the person has the required knowledge. There should be a strong link between the behavioral objective and the content of the lesson. It should be unacceptable, for instance, if you have the objective, identify 5 types of chemicals, but then give learners activities in which they learn the different compositions of chemicals. The behavioral objectives should therefore respond with the lesson topics. Here you can see the characteristics of educational objectives. The well-stated objectives should be smart and focused. Let us conclude the teaching on objectives with the reasons for objectives displayed here on the screen. When designing a lesson or stating objectives, it is important to know how easy or difficult the lesson has to be. What is the level of the learners that you teach? On what level should assessment be designed? In the next lesson, we will discuss taxonomy of Bloom, which will help us to define the levels upon which we teach and assess. The first version of the taxonomy was published in 1956 and updated in 2001, making a shift from nouns to verbs and revising the 2 higher thinking domains. The following diagram gives an indication of Bloom's taxonomy as it was revised. Teaching and learning should thus be guided by the revised taxonomy. Take a good look at an explanation of the different levels.